Hi, this is Brett Berg from AGFA, and I'm here with Evan Purcell, who's behind Ask Anybody, which is a film, an Instagram account, and a podcast. I'm very excited to have this chat with you, and I know very little about Gay Girls Writing Club. Because it seems like an anonymous name, how often does Gay Girls Writing Club come up in your research, and how often do you come across ephemera related to it?
I first became acquainted with the GGRC, I believe it was through back issues of the Spree News Pictorial. Spree was the Society of Pat Rocco Enlightened Enthusiasts, and they were another gay social club that was based out of Los Angeles around the same time as the GGRC. But beyond that, there really isn't too much documentation of the group or these films. I'd sometimes come across reviews of them or ads for them or photos from them, but it's very, very difficult to actually see the films themselves.
Why is that? Is that because everybody involved is no longer with us and there's no clear owner of the films?
I think that's at least part of it. These films never got any sort of video release in the 80s or 90s. Something Weird Video released 2 volumes of them as gay camp classics in the early 2000s, but those were pulled from circulation very quickly. I believe Pat Rocco sold some of them through his mail order service, but that was never really widely advertised anywhere, and as such, copies have been very scarce. So they've, for the most part, been completely unavailable since the 70s, really.
This film seems to have a little bit of money behind it because there's all this like animation and DIY filmmaking stuff going on. They're in a mansion somewhere. Like, how did these come together if this was just a social club?
Well, I think we need to emphasize that this was a Hollywood social club. So I wouldn't be surprised if many of the members were involved in the film industry to varying degrees or had connections they could use to call in some favors for props or locations or equipment.
So all this Oscar stuff, we've learned recently that this was shade done for a reason. So what was the purpose behind all this Oscar stuff?
Well, if you know your Oscar history or have seen the Ryan Murphy series Feud, you'll know that Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, the stars of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, both camp icons in their own right, had a long-running feud going on through that film's production and release. Joan Crawford was only nominated for Best Supporting Actress when she thought she should have been nominated for Best Actress alongside Bette Davis, and out of anger, she engineered it so that if any of the other nominees won the Best Actress award, she would accept it in their place. So Anne Bancroft, who won for The Miracle Worker and actually could not be there because she was doing a show in New York, she won, and Joan sauntered up to the stage, collect the award, and in the process made Bette Davis so angry that apparently she stomped off and left before the ceremony even ended. So this film, which we were able to determine was shot literally just weeks after that ceremony, opens with a scene of Joan Crawford winning an Oscar, which has nothing to do with the original film. We don't see Blanche Hudson winning any awards. Only minutes later to get run down by Bette Davis driving a real Rolls Royce. And the film ends with this kind of wonderful wish fulfillment climax where Bette gets the award that she truly deserved and makes good with Joan in a real Hollywood ending.
There's a director's credit here for Connie B. DeMille. Is there any known person attached to this name?
That's actually Ray Harrison, who is the founder of the Gay Girls Writing Club. I can't really find too much info about him. He kind of sort of drops off the face of the earth after like 1975. But he was at one point an assistant on the Spike Jonze show. And interestingly enough, as you'll see through all the films on this Blu-ray set, as the 60s progressed, he actually started using his actual name on the film. So I think it's Spy on the Fly and All About Alice have the actual credit of Ray Harrison and not Connie B. DeMille.
Was that risky for him to do at the time?
Oh, absolutely. Especially, I mean, we're talking about, the early 1960s here. I think one other thing to think about, too, is the fact that these films were originally only made to be shown in bars and at parties. So the people there would have known who Connie B. DeMille actually was, and it would have just been, another joke.
Do we know the names of any of these performers? Like their real names?
The only person in this film that I really know anything about is Frida, who plays Baby Jane Hudson. Frida was the drag persona created by Warren Fremming, who is someone who was active in the GGRC all the way up through the late 80s. Frida also performed at a lot of Los Angeles drag venues like Joni Presents. If you see Pat Rocco's Mondo Rocco, you'll see her as the MC at a whole drag review, and it's really entertaining. Just recently, I saw a video recording of the GGRC's 1986 or 87 Halloween party, which was hosted by Frida in full drag, and it's really great to see her, 20 years after this film. Sadly, I believe she passed away in 1988, so it was one of her last years doing the party.
Where would this be shown? Would this only be shown at parties thrown by Gay Girls Writing Club? I'm assuming these didn't hit cinemas.
So in the early 60s, when they first started making these films, they would play at bars, they'd play at parties. I believe this film premiered at the Edgewater Hotel in San Francisco as part of like a charity drag show event. But then again, as the decade progressed and, as gay theaters started popping up near the end of the 60s, these films would get distribution and play in what were basically the precursors to porn theaters. You'd go see some Beefcake, and then you'd also get to see what really happened to Baby Jane or All About Alice.
So it was kind of the norm back then, as I'm understanding it, late 60s into 70, 71, 72, that if you had a porn theater, they weren't just showing 100% porn because there wasn't enough product necessarily. So they had to extend their programs with shorts that are just of a queer nature, right?
Yeah, it's that, and hardcore wasn't legalized by that point, so you could only really do softcore. And it's interesting because in the late 60s, The Advocate, the famous gay newspaper, they did a reader's poll of people who went to these screenings. And at the top of the list for their favorite films that they like seeing were the GGRC shorts. So not the physique stuff, not the Beefcake stuff, but these little drag queen parodies of, popular films.
And we were talking earlier, you mentioned that these might be considered the first drag films?
Some of the first. The only real sort of contemporaries I can think of to these are the Avagraph films that were made by Avery Willard in New York. Later became known as Bruce King, who was the publisher of Gay Scene, which was one of New York's first gay papers, and he made a few gay films under that name. But the Avagraph films were all, for the most part, drag films that starred people like Mario Montez, Charles Ludlam, Jack Smith, Adrian. I believe they started in 1958, so right around the same time the GGRC did. And the sad thing about those is that prints of them still exist, but they're pretty much impossible to see. The New York Public Library has the archive, and nothing has really been done with them. But I find it really interesting. One of the things I really try to get at on my podcast, the Ask Anybody podcast, is the regional differences that these films have. You have these East Coast films by Avagraph, by Jack Smith, by the Kuchar brothers, and all these other people, which are very weird little underground things. But on the West Coast, with the GGRC, you have these little miniature Hollywood productions like What Really Happened to Baby Jane, or A Romance Springs on Mrs. Stone, or All About Alice.
Gay Girls Writing Club started out as a method of throwing Halloween parties. Just Halloween parties, or parties in general?
I think more parties in general, but the Halloween parties were what they were famous for. The first one was in 1959, and they ran for at least 30 years after that. They were major parts of LA's gay social scene. I think, for me, one of my favorite parts about this aspect of their story is their involvement in the creation of the Cycle Sluts, which, if anyone out there hasn't heard of them, they're kind of a genderfuck leather drag group that was created, I believe, in 1975, as outfits for a bunch of people to go to the Halloween party as. They're kind of like if you took the Cockettes and dressed them all up in leather. They did a stage show at the Roxy, and they toured the world, actually, doing camp versions of songs and chorus lines, and basically doing variety shows.
So the club started in the late 50s. And when did they decide to turn to filmmaking? Was there any one person among them that said, we have to do this. We've got to do this. We've got to spend thousands of dollars on doing this.
I'm not entirely sure what the impetus for these films were, but there are two direct Hollywood connections that I do know of. The first, a cinematographer, James Crabe, who shot films like Rocky and The Karate Kid. He was responsible for lensing Spy on the Fly and All About Alice and some of the later films. Something actually kind of funny there is that there's a Jack DeVoe film from 1978 called A Night at the Adonis, and that film was heavily advertised as being the first film shot in Cruiserama. It was shot at the Adonis Theater, which was basically the biggest gay porn theater in the world at the time, and the opening features a Steadicam shot going all the way through the theater, up in the balcony, down near in the orchestra pit, on the stage, and they were able to accomplish that by borrowing a Steadicam from Rocky, from the set of Rocky. So James Crabe, had his hands in multiple pots. So there's him, and there's also Christopher Morley, who appears in Spy on the Fly and All About Alice in drag, who'd go on to more success in drag roles on film and television, including maybe most famously as the character known only as Transvestite in Freebie and the Bean, who gets murdered for being the villain.
Did Pat Rocco get the inspiration to make movies from participating in these?
I'm not entirely sure what Pat Rocco's involvement with the GGRC was, but he was someone who came out of the physique world. He was doing magazine layouts before he ever got into filmmaking, and that was later in 1968. I think the clearest parallel you can make with the GGRC, though, is Spree, which I mentioned earlier, is the Society of Pat Rocco Enlightened Enthusiasts, which was a social club, which kind of started off as a fan club for Pat Rocco in 1969, but by the turn of the decade, they'd evolved into this huge organization. They had a theatrical workshop that produced gay plays monthly at Troopers Hall in Los Angeles. They had a film workshop. They did amateur film competitions. They did outings to the mountains or to Disneyland or other places around LA. They were very active in the community, and they lasted for a long, long time, I think through 1978. So they were around for almost a decade. Oh, one thing I want to note real quick is the mother here in this scene is, I believe, played by Ray Harrison himself, and this ad that we see, the newspaper that it was pasted onto was from April 22nd, 1963. So that gives us an approximate date of when the film was actually made.
Is the person in the Victor Buono role the same person who's playing the Bette Davis role?
No, it's not.
It just looks similar.
I think it's kind of brilliant, though, to kind of take that character who is kind of weaselly and kind of like bratty and turn him into like a full-on man-child in this.
The phenomenon of gay social clubs, now it's perhaps a bit redundant because there's all kinds of ways for queers to meet. But what was this network like? Did they advertise through handbills, like come meet up with us? Was it just a tight circle of friends?
The earliest mentions of the group I've ever been able to find were, I believe, in back issues of the Citizen News, which was an early gay activist paper based out of San Francisco in the early 60s, which was less advertising and more of reports of, the things that they were doing, or saying, come to the party to see what really happened to Baby Jane. They'll be showing their movies at this party. It's not really until the late 60s when The Advocate starts up that you really start seeing more ads for actual events. Spree, which we've talked about a few times on this, were very active in advertising their events. And something we haven't talked about is that the GGRC always met on Sundays, and as part of that, they only shot these films on Sundays, too. So their later film, All About Alice, was shot over like 6 or 7 or 8 Sundays, which is crazy to think about, only shooting one day a week.
Is there a reason for the Sunday orthodoxy? Just because it's like, dude, you might as well be orthodox about something?
I have no clue, but it's just that for these films that are so clearly so professional, just the idea of, having to rent cameras or buy equipment or rent equipment to shoot a single day a week, it's kind of unheard of to me, at least.
Yeah, I mean, the typical indie thing is that you rent the camera package for the whole weekend and you just spend 3 days doing as much as you can. Let's go over some of the contemporaries of Gay Girls Writing Club, at least in the filmmaking space. We mentioned Avery Willard. Who is Avery Willard?
He was a photographer who, like I said, wound up creating Gay Scene, which was one of New York's first gay newspapers. They ran up through, I believe, the early 90s. He also made a couple of adult films, Leather Narcissus, Rugged Men, and La Voyeur. But he was very active in the drag scene in the late 50s and the early 60s. He published a book called Female Impersonation, which is really kind of an amazing document of the drag scene and the trans scene in New York at the time. Also, one thing I want to point out right here is that we haven't talked about this yet, is that all of these props that we're seeing, all these sheet music pages, the poster, are props from the original film. So we were talking about Hollywood connections. Here you go, right here. The Baby Jane doll that Warren Freming is playing around with throughout the entire film, that's an original prop from the film, too.
I see a quote here in your notes from Robert Aldrich's son. Robert Aldrich is the director of the original Baby Jane. If it was done, I can tell you that it was unauthorized, which may be one of the reasons why I had difficulty seeing it. And I'm wondering, reading that quote, I'm wondering just how shielded was early queer culture from mainstream culture. Like, was this 100% underground, or if you bothered to look for like a minute, you could find it?
In the early 60s, not so much, but in the later 60s and throughout the 70s and 80s, screenings of films like these would be advertised in the newspaper. The LA Times, the New York Times, pretty much any local newspaper would have full listings for adult theaters and softcore theaters or whatnot. So,
who from this group went on to make other movies? Or were there any folks from this collective that had the urge long beyond GGRC?
You know, the only other person I know of is a GGRC member named Herb Danforth, who made a feature or a short called Why the West Was Fun, or Home on the Range is a Drag, which is, I think it's a lost film, but I'd imagine it kind of follows the same sort of template that these films do, which is, I think, really kind of notable because it played at the very first Campout, which is the first openly advertised gay screening in Los Angeles. There's a theater in LA called the Apollo Arts Theater that was owned by Shan Sales, who ran the Park Theater. And by day, they were a heterosexual sexploitation theater, but beginning in the late 1967, they'd hold these little underground midnight screenings called campouts, where they'd show physique films, camp films, all at midnight, and just, I think, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Every couple months, they do these little screenings. And I think that's kind of what sort of set into motion what would eventually turn into the Park Theater's Most Unusual Film Festival in June 1968, which was the first gay film festival.
How many of the Writing Club's movies are in that festival? Because I know all about this one, but I forget which movies and how many movies were shown.
I believe the Park Theater's gay programming lasted for about 2 years, and over the course of that 2 years, I believe every single GGRC film was shown. This one certainly did. I know Spy on the Fly played as a feature. Roman Springs on Mrs. Stone, I believe, was shown. Le Boys, which I believe isn't included on this set, but is a document of a drag review at a club in Los Angeles, that premiered there. And when the park kind of expanded to New York and Houston, these films also went with them. So these films really did actually get distribution. You could go, if you were in New York, you could go see What Really Happened to Baby Jane at a theater. But the funny thing about this one is this one was so underground that they would just advertise it as the GGRC's Gothic classic.
Were they afraid of being sued over this?
I think they might have been, yeah.
So beyond Baby Jane, did they get to make any features? How far did their ambition as this group go? Because I imagine at some point the ambition probably ran up against like what they could accomplish by only doing stuff on Sundays.
Their last film, which is their most ambitious one by far, is All About Alice, which is a full-on drag remake of All About Eve. Shot in color with an original theme song. It's a feature, and I love that film. It's included on this set. I hope people will watch it and enjoy it because it's really kind of wonderful. But it's a film that makes me realize that they were kind of hopelessly out of date by that time. That film was made, I believe, in like 1972, 1973, and by that time, hardcore had completely taken over. People aren't gonna pay to go see an all drag queen version of All About Eve, even if it does have like a couple brief shots of like Beefcake from Dakota, who was the owner of Gold's Gym.
Why did hardcore completely preclude other forms of sexploitation expression? I mean, didn't gay men like a good night out at the cinema?
They did, but at the same time, why go see simulations of the real thing when you can see the real thing itself, you know?
True. By the time that this film happened, where are we in the progression of camp? Where is the Susan Sontag moment in relation to this?
I think one of the things that really stands out to me about this film is, this is a very early drag parody, but even then, it kind of shows all the hallmarks of what would come to be the comedy style of drag. It's obviously a parody, but things aren't, elevated too much. They're just elevated just enough so that they're funny. And the fact that this film is kind of like this wish fulfillment film about Bette Davis getting her Oscar, I think kind of goes along with that too. It's not just a parody for the sake of a parody. There is kind of a deeper meaning here, as silly as that sounds.
So this is an early example of drag culture. And how far back does drag culture with its signifiers and its tropes, how far back does that go in 20th century American culture?
Well, I'm not an expert when it comes to drag history, but I do know that the art form does have its roots going all the way back to the late 1800s with vaudeville and minstrel shows and things like that. It's really not until the late 1930s, early 1940s that drag as we know it kind of becomes a thing. I think a really great example of that is the Jewel Box Revue, which was one of, if not the biggest touring drag revues in the country. They were integrated racially, so they had people of various ethnicities. They had drag kings, they had drag queens, and they toured up and down the black theater circuit, all up and down the country. I know they did residencies at the Apollo in New York, and they were around for a very long time. I think it was maybe around up until the mid-70s. And then moving into the 50s, we see drag become kind of a little more mainstream with things like Club 82 in New York, which was a very popular drag nightclub, which I think the important thing to note there is that the target audience was not queer people. It was straight people who would go out and have a fun night on the town watching these men dress as women do, stage shows. And the thing that's really, I think, remarkable about these films and the Ava Graf films is that they are the first examples of drag films made by and for queer people. This isn't Stan Laurel or Buster Keaton dressing as women and, camping it up. This is true representation.
Tell us more about what you think of the other Gay Girls Writing Club movies. What are your favorites?
I believe this was the first one that I saw, and it was everything I'd kind of hoped for and more. From there, I think I saw Spy on the Fly, which is their James Bond parody, which is incredibly ambitious. It looks like a mainstream sexploitation film from that time. I think they shot it in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and it's got all these locations and a huge cast, and it's just incredible. Then I saw Les Boys, which I feel like is kind of the lesser of their films because it is just a recording of a drag show. But at the same time, it's really interesting to see what was popular in drag culture at the time. Even at that time, I think 1968, 69, you see multiple people doing Judy Garland. You see Phyllis Diller. You see Tina Turner. You see, Barbara Streisand. You see all these icons who, people think of now. But at the time, people were already doing that. And the sort of drag routines with those icons had already been solidified.
Do you imagine that the folks that made these movies consider themselves artists, or was this just a goof off?
I think it's somewhere between the two, and especially, as the sort of gay theater system started, becoming an actual thing, the gay film industry started becoming a thing in the late 60s, you see them really trying to make things that are more commercial, The film started getting longer after this one, and then that kind of culminates with All About Alice, which didn't really have a market to fit in and barely played. And after that, I think they kind of wrapped things up. Ray Harrison made a couple of hardcore shorts, one of which played with All About Alice. But after that, I think he just kind of threw in the towel.
Are there any equivalents to the Gay Girls Writing Club in underground queer filmmaking? Did anybody else in the 60s or 70s go to the lengths in terms of getting locations? I know Kurt McDowell's Thundercrack is an interesting example, but how many people were really visionaries making these films? And what was Gay Girls Writing Club, at least in Los Angeles, at the forefront of this underground queer filmmaking scene?
I think the thing that stands out to me the most about the GGRC is just how unique they were. you know? All these other sort of underground groups in the 60s and 70s were very low budget, very underground, very ragged, for lack of a better term. But here with these GGRC films, they have a budget. They have access to mansions and Rolls Royces and fancy cars and cameras and like talented filmmakers. And I think if you watch these films, especially, you know, now restored on Blu-ray, they're virtually indistinguishable from, you know, mainstream sexploitation films or noir films from the 60s. There's a lot of talent and a lot of technique and a lot of time behind these films. If you watch something like Jack Smith's Flaming Creatures, this is not that. If you watch a Kucharov Brothers film, this is not that. This is an honest-to-God movie, as opposed to just, you know, kind of like a little one-off.
Mm-hmm. And, who does this remind you of in like later films?
You know, when I was rewatching this, it really made me think a lot of the underground drag parodies that people like RuPaul, Tom Rubnitz, Vaginal Davis were making in the 80s and 90s. Have you seen RuPaul's remake of Trilogy of Terror?
I have not. I will look for that soon.
It's on YouTube, and I highly recommend checking it out because it's kind of wonderful, and it's really the same type of parody that you see here with this film, you know, 30 years prior. But I think the one current that kind of runs through all these films over all these years is these people are just making these little things just to do something with their friends and to show their friends and to just have a laugh. There's no real commercial consideration in any of this. It's just to have fun. I would suspect that those films cost a lot less to make than these did, though.
Yeah, probably shot on tape, right?
Yes. Oh, absolutely on tape.
Yeah. Who is Tom Rubnitz?
Tom Rubnitz was an artist and video maker who was very closely aligned with the downtown art scene in New York in the late 80s to early 90s. That whole drag scene that sprung up around the Pyramid Club and featured people like RuPaul, Lady Bunny, John Sex, Lahoma Van Zant, John Kelly, and so many other talented people. In some of his videos, like Made for TV with Ann Magnuson, received mainstream attention. I feel like the works of his that have kind of gone on to have the longest life are the ones that were so obviously tossed off and just made with his friends. If you look up Pickle Surprise on YouTube, that video has probably millions and millions of views now, and I would say is so hugely responsible for the aesthetic of drag nowadays.
Is there a point in time when these movies went out of circulation, and is there any particular reason why?
These films, you know, after the early 70s kind of just disappeared for a while, but it wasn't until the 80s that they kind of had revivals. The Frameline Film Festival, the San Francisco Gay and Lesbian Film Festival in 1984, had a full retrospective of the GGRC's films, and I believe they did another one in 1992. BFI Flair, which was then the London Gay Lesbian Film Festival, did a program of these shorts in the early 90s too. And beyond that, that's just kind of been it. It's not until now that these films will actually have a fully wide release, and hopefully one that'll last for a long time, unlike Something Weirds. So that's really exciting to me, and I'm really happy for people to finally be able to see these films, which I think are so wonderful. I love how at the end of this, it kind of turns into the ending of The Seventh Seal, or a Fellini film with them all dancing on the beach.
Right. And that stuff was pretty contemporary back then.
Oh, yeah. I mean, also, just the fact that they're shooting this on what I'm assuming was a public beach is kind of absurd to think about. These car chase... You know, we missed it, but during the car chase scene, you see there's a shot of two of the actors holding onto the back of a car that's being driven by Bette Davis, and there's a cop car on the side of the road that they go just right by. I think the thing that really inspires me about these films is the danger that these filmmakers put themselves in just to, you know, get their little visions on film. Just to make these little things that they could show other people and have fun with. So, Brett, before I started telling you guys at ACFA about these films, you'd never heard about them before, right?
I had never heard of them.
So I have to ask, what are your thoughts on this film or the GGRC as a whole? Or
it's kind of like, well, you know, film itself as a medium started in late 1800s, early 1900s, and these films are very the Gay Girls Writing Club films are very technically proficient, but they feel like transmissions from Mars. first off. They feel like from another dimension. And they also have a kind of early dawn of cinema feel to them because it really was the dawn of queer culture in America kind of being able to express themselves like this. So it does feel like cave paintings in a way, but the bitchiness remains. Like, you cannot deny how like catty some of this stuff is. And just like the constants throughout queer culture, you know, that really astounds me that things that played well 60 years ago still have relevance in drag culture.
It was really heartening for me to see that our great-grandfathers also made 69 jokes. So
not only that, but HO 6969.
That's the sequel to Butterfield 8, HO 6969.
Well, as we come to the end of this, Evan, thanks again for sitting with us once again and enlightening us about stuff that, as a queer person, you tell me more about our own culture than I know, and I always thank you for it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brett. It's really so exciting to me that these films are finally getting an actual release, and I hope that everyone who watches this will take the time to watch the rest of the films on the disc, because I think they're all just really, really a lot of fun.
And tell people about your Instagram and your podcast.
My Ask Anybody project is all about the history of the gay adult film industry. If you want to know more on Instagram, my account is Ask Anybody. We have a podcast that's on all major platforms, and then the website ask-any-buddy.com.